Good evening. We call to order the October 28th meeting of the Planning and Zoning Board. We'll start off like we always do with the adoption of our agenda. If anyone has any changes, I'll hear them now. If not, I'll look for a motion.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Next, we'll move to the approval of our regular meeting minutes, and those were the September 23rd meeting minutes. Again, if anyone has any changes, please say so, or else I'll be looking for a motion.
I'll make a motion.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Another unanimous. Next, we'll be moving to our new business. We're going to start with the recognition of our new board members. For this term, we're having two new members, one regular member and one alternate. So I would like to welcome Jessica Pearson and John Sorrell to the board. They'll be serving us, so you'll be seeing them often. Next, we're going to move to the appointment of our vice chair. I'll accept any nominations for anyone who thinks they could fit that role.
Even though he's not here, I would like to nominate Dan. When my first day, I remember he was very helpful to me. That was over 3 years ago, and I think he's the most senior person on the board right now. So I'd like to put his name in for consideration.
Okay.
This is something we second. Or just discuss.
I don't. I think we just discussed.
Okay. I agree with Steve. I think that he would be a phenomenal second chair.
Yeah, I agree.
I'll second the nomination.
All right. Well, if there are no other nominations, we'll take that to a vote. All in favor of nominating Dan McFarland as our vice chair, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Carries unanimous.
That's what he gets for not being here.
I guess exactly.
That's exactly what I was
Miss
thinking.
another meeting.
He's either going to be very happy or mad. I don't know which.
So moving to our cases for this evening. Our first case is the Act 13 amendments, and Matt Flynn will be presenting that. Good evening.
Good evening, Chairman. Good evening, board members, and good evening, new board members. Tonight we have the Act 13 amendment to the Land Development Ordinance to revise the Town of Cary standards for floodplain management. Over the past 18 months, staff at Council's direction has undertaken a number of stormwater initiatives to improve our level of service to our citizens. A few examples of this include implementing a dynamic flood model in the downtown area that's allowing us to make better stormwater decisions. It's a pilot project that will be expanded throughout the town. Staff is also proactively maintaining and cleaning our storm drain systems, as well as upgrading failing and undersized infrastructure that's reducing flooding frequency in a number of historically problematic areas throughout the town. And tonight's revision to our ordinance is another important step in the implementation of our adaptive stormwater policies. So none of this work is being done in a vacuum. We have 45 staff members from multiple departments participating in this, as well as, and most importantly, a downtown stormwater working group that's comprised of private citizens who are stormwater experts, as well as citizens who've been directly impacted by flooding. So to create a framework for you in tonight's decision, you'll note this is a modern subdivision in front of you, and you'll notice that a majority of it, or all of it, is built well outside the floodplain and riparian buffer. These are all areas that are prone to flood inundation. After 2001, our council prohibited development in those areas, which is kind of a benchmark that we need to think about as we work through tonight's ordinance. You'll also notice highlighted the storm drain system terminates into a stormwater control measure that's designed to mitigate for both water quality and water quantity impacts from new development. Currently, we require the 1, 2, 5, and 10-year storm events to be mitigated. And just for reference, the state requires the 1-year storm only. This was really effective when we built in greenfield development. But as we're starting to transition more into infill and redevelopment, we're seeing these types of new developments occur adjacent to the types of development that occurred prior to our current regulations. A good example of that would be Stone Creek Village. It's at the northwest corner of Davison High House, and this is the old Rigsby Farms in 1988. In 1999, you'll notice the Rigsby Farm subdivision to the north was built all in the stream buffer, a lot of those lots were there, and they experienced backyard flooding. 2005, Stone Creek Village, which was a highly dense, large, mixed-use development, came in for a rezoning, and the big fear from those residents was that current flooding would be exacerbated and potentially impact their backyard or their houses and their structures, playground equipment, and all that kind of stuff. So in response, in 2009, the developer offered a condition to mitigate the 100-year storm, which is kind of the standard that we set for finding the water surface elevation to regulate to for FEMA conditions. So now we have a mixed-use development that was highly successful, and as a result, that development mitigated completely the flooding and in fact reduced it. So stormwater management works. It's a really effective tool when done properly. So in response to that, staff is proposing that new development, in addition to our current regulations, mitigate the 100-year storm or provide a modeling alternative to show no adverse impact. This gives council assurance during rezonings that stormwater will be mitigated. It also is mutually beneficial to developers insofar that they now have predictability during the rezoning process. Oftentimes I see during the rezoning process, developers have to do some engineering unanticipated to try to account for these types of things. Developers will have two choices. The first is a prescriptive choice, which is to mitigate on-site those storm events I just described, or to account for unique situations, and they do happen in stormwater, modeling approach to mitigate to the best possible and then show no adverse impact. As you go further down in a watershed, you have a phenomena that happens like what's called compounding peak flow, which allows upstream water to catch up. So it's a dynamic model that captures all of those variables. The whole purpose of this is to keep Cary great, to separate out development from flood-prone areas, and to remove new development from the equation to allow staff to go forward with our policies to try to reduce that data set of existing properties in flood-prone areas. And we're working on those policies. It's a town council public hearing on September 26th. 2 speakers spoke in support of this, and council unanimously expressed support for the amendment as well. Staff finds the proposed amendment to be consistent with the Imagine Cary community plan. It supports SERV policies to encourage environmentally responsible stormwater management, as well as protect and restore open space and the natural environment. It also helps to implement our ACT recommendation for identifying pressing public service challenges facing the town of Cary and recommend approaches for addressing them. So with that, I'm available to answer any questions you may have.
Great, thank you. I'll now open it up for board questions. If anyone has any questions.
Yeah, I have one question with, in section 12.4, other key terms defined, under the floodplain 1% annual chance or floodplain, base floodplain, most of that paragraph is stricken. Is that intentional?
So what we're doing is clarifying our definition to meet the legal terms, but Lisa, can you speak to that?
So I was looking, this is too tall. I was looking for it just now. So I think we did mean to take all that text out, so the complete sentence should be the special flood hazard area. So the floodplain, so Matt, you help me out. Yep. The 1% annual chance or base floodplain is the special flood hazard area. So we're trying to use more concise, precise terminology and not use 3 different ways of talking about the same area. So that was the intent of the changes in the definition section. And we can go back through and make sure we've done it correctly, but I believe that was the intent, is just to say it one way.
That's right.
Okay.
And the 1% is the most restrictive one?
1% is the 100-year floodplain.
Okay.
1% in any annual year, there's a chance of that. So we're trying to be consistent with the state and FEMA definition. And FEMA, of course, will look at this after we adopt it.
Well, with the wonders of computers and the internet, when I printed it, it printed out with no strike-throughs.
We'll have to look at the online. It may be incorrect online versus what we have in the,
But it looks quite correct here as I look at it.
it might just be a mechanical error.
Any other questions?
I have a question. Do you think that these proposed amendments will help the development community because they'll have information before they move forward?
That's certainly the mutually beneficial portion of this, is that they'll come in understanding what they have to do. Council has a level of comfort, so it's one less obstacle that they deal with rezonings, and then the discussion can truly be what it should be, which is a land use discussion.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
So I have a question, and it's probably really basic, but certainly these floodplain issues are a huge concern to residents, and certainly I'm sure they are to the people who live in some of the older areas where you didn't have a plan in place. But there's a huge variation in my mind between a 1% or a 1-year floodplain and a 100-year event. Can you just sort of capture at a high level where those different phases kick into this
So
ordinance?
the 1-year storm is really more of a water quality storm. It's the storm identified that creates bankful benchmark, which is the erosion of channels. So when you see a channel, that's kind of the 1-year storm creating that. So that was created by the state of North Carolina for water quality purposes to reduce sediment load. The 2, 5, 10, and 100 were more for flood mitigation, which is why we're moving it to that portion of our ordinance. And the purpose there is to capture each one of those storms, because if you're just mitigating the 100, you could very well allow the 5-year just to pass through freely. So it's within the 100-year extent, you have all of those other events creating flooding. So you could have a structure in the 5-year floodplain. So capturing all of those is the purpose for mitigating to that maximum extent. Does that answer your question?
I think so.
Yep.
I don't need to be an expert in that area, thankfully.
We can talk offline. I'm always available, so.
I do have a question for you, Mr. Flynn. Looking at adjacent communities, how would you say Cary stacks up? Do most of the other communities just focus on the 1, 2, 5, and 10, or do they already take the 100 into account?
So the state rule is for the 1-year only. So when we did the 10-year, it was an order of magnitude greater. That was 10 years ago. And it was more kind of to capture, we were more of a greenfield development community at that point, but it was to ensure that we weren't creating a lot of those rural areas being impacted. What we found over that 10-year period is we're developing a lot closer to areas that really are in the floodplain and really are in stream buffers. And you got to remember, the FEMA floodplain only captures flooding areas 1 square mile or greater. We know flooding occurs in streams smaller than that. So that our stream buffer rules are kind of a proxy to try to eliminate those smaller areas. Of course, a lot of that development occurred prior to, so the purpose of this is to make sure that we're not impacting any of those areas going forward. Our standard will be the highest in the state after this. Yep.
Okay. If there are no other questions,
I have one quick
Go ahead.
question. Section 7.33 has a criteria for the downstream analysis in the current system that requires study down to the point where I believe it's a 10% of the total drainage basin.
That's correct.
How is that replaced in the new code?
So we've gotten rid of that really prescriptive number. So what we found is, especially in areas that have existing flooding, 10%, they really can't stand any more flooding. So it's to get rid of that loophole and require them to mitigate or show no adverse impact in those existing conditions. The flip side is, if you're developing next to a floodplain and your drainage area is like 1/1,000,000th of the drainage area, there's no point in over mitigating in those cases. But what we found is over the 10 years of our previous lifespan of our ordinance, a handful of developers did a downstream analysis, and a majority of them ended up mitigating on site. So what we're going to find is overwhelming majority are just going to mitigate on site.
Thank you.
Bet.
Anyone else? In that case, I'll be looking for a motion.
I can make a motion. I move that the board find LDO Amendment Act 13 is consistent with the comprehensive plan and all other applicable plans for the reasons set forth in the staff report, presentation, and discussion by the Planning and Zoning Board.
Second.
Go ahead with discussion.
I mean, obviously, we've sat here and had so many people come in and you see concerns with stormwater. So, you know, I think just from a viewpoint of us listening on here, this is needed. I think it will be interesting to see how this rolls out in the future, and especially with the infill stuff, you know, how developers deal with this. You know, I guess the future will show us.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is an incredibly important issue for communities that are maturing, and I just think it's really important that the town of Cary is addressing this head on. I also think it's really critical for the development community to really understand the rules of engagement. So for that, I support this as well.
Yeah, in that regard, I understand that there's been some fairly good buy-in by the development community in the process of developing this. So hopefully everybody has some agreement on the rules and go in with their eyes wide open.
Yeah, it mentioned too in the report that engineering firms were consulted too. And so, you know, you want the firms that would be working with the developers to really understand and support it as well. So
We did a extensive educational outreach effort to the developers and to the engineering firms.
that's great.
Yeah.
Any other discussion? In that case, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Carries unanimous.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll be moving to our next case of this evening, 19 REZ 02. Good evening, Ms. Grannon.
Good evening. Again, welcome to the new board members. It's nice to see you this evening. We've got a rezoning case for you for property located at the corner of Alston Avenue and O'Kelly Chapel Road on approximately 18.9 acres. Subject property is highlighted here in yellow on the south side of Alston Avenue. It's part of one of the Alston neighborhoods. Subject property is currently part of the Alston Activity Center concept plan. And with this concept plan, there's a mixture of different neighborhoods and different traffic zones. And this particular neighborhood, the Evans Farm neighborhood, was designated for residential use. It included single-family residential and townhomes, but it did not include multifamily as an option. So this was a plan, Activity Center concept plan, that was adopted over 10 years ago, back when the densities were a little bit lower in this area. And since that time, we've adopted the Imagine Cary Community Plan and designated this area as a destination center. So it can now support higher densities. We anticipate higher densities in an area like this. According to the growth framework map, this is where you would expect the most intense development. So knowing that, the applicant has asked to be removed from the Activity Center concept plan, and they've proposed a change from the base zoning district, which is residential 40, and they're asking to be rezoned to MXD, mixed use district. Now, the question came up, what is MXD if it's just residential? And MXD is the zoning category for uses in the destination center. It can be one use, it could be just townhomes, or it could be just multifamily, or in this case, a combination of both. Or they could ask for a mixture of non-residential uses as well. But because this was residential to begin with, they're just adding one new category with residential, and they're sort of designing their own zoning district. That's what the MXD district is where each case is unique in that the developer or applicant also submits a preliminary development plan. With that preliminary development plan, they define their own setbacks, building heights, buffers, and land uses and the mixture of uses. So with the Alston Preliminary Development Plan, they have proposed 330 multifamily units, 41 townhomes, 15,300 square feet of community gathering space. And they've also proposed a condition that public roads in the townhome portion of the property would be public streets, would be offered for dedication as public streets. That wouldn't apply in front of the residential multifamily. Also, with a preliminary development plan and this MXD zoning designation, it's the opportunity for the developer, the applicant, to ask for certain modifications to typical LDO standards. They are seeking a 30% parking reduction just for the residential multifamily portion of the site. No reduction for the townhome portion of the site. We see this a lot. We see a lot of requests for reductions to parking when it's residential multifamily. In this case, they've got a number of one-bedroom apartments. They're in close proximity to RTP. Those are some of the things that we look at that help to justify that parking reduction. Staff has never been very supportive of reductions to parking for townhomes, because we know then you're going to get more families living in townhomes and people having gatherings and events and home ownership. You're going to get more cars typically. But again, the reduction only applies to the RMF. They've also proposed the removal of one champion tree, and that's located here. It is a 34-inch oak. A champion tree for our new members is any hardwood tree other than a sweet gum that's 32 inches in diameter at breast height, or a pine tree that's 40 inches in diameter at breast height. So that's how we define champion trees in our LDO. And again, as part of this process, they can ask for that to be removed and not have to come back later and go to a quasi-judicial public hearing for that reduction. According to the Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources Facilities Master Plan, there is a greenway trail that cuts through a portion of the property, and the preliminary development plan does show that the applicant proposes to complete that trail. There is some impact by stream buffers on the site according to our most recent GIS maps, and the applicant is aware of this and has addressed that with their preliminary development plan. So they're prepared to address stormwater management at the time of development plan review. This shows the location of the property on Alston Avenue, which is a local road. There was a traffic analysis required, and the circles in green show you the intersections that were studied as part of the TIA, or traffic impact analysis. When this was first presented to Town Council for a public hearing, we noted that we had some concerns that the intersection of O'Kelly Chapel Road and Alston Avenue did not have any mitigations offered to address traffic impacts at that intersection. So since that traffic study was made a recommendation for this, and since the Town Council public hearing, the applicant has come back with a new zoning condition that they would do a signal warrant analysis both at the beginning of the development and then before it's completed. So if warranted, then they would install a traffic signal at this intersection. So that changed things for staff in terms of our level of concern with this request. There was a neighborhood meeting here at Town Hall back in March. There was no one expressing any concerns about this other than an adjacent property owner interested in what development opportunities they had. At the Town Council public hearing in August, there were no speakers other than the applicant. The council did have some discussions about the amount of open space, and what they're proposing is approximately 3 times larger than what the ordinance would require. And we've not had any phone calls or emails. We've conducted an analysis of the request against the Imagine Cary Community Plan and found that the live, shape, shop, work, and move chapters are all applicable. Especially in regard to shape, we've looked at transitions to adjacent development and taken into consideration what's being proposed. They're looking at the multifamily residential portion up toward the front and the westernmost portion of the property, and then looking at the townhome development over here to the eastern portion of the property that would be adjacent to a townhome development that's currently in review, and the residential multifamily portion would be adjacent to a development project that's already been approved and is in the process of being developed. So staff finds that the request is consistent with the overall Imagine Cary community plan and see that the request does support policies from the Live, Work, Shape, and Move chapters by providing housing opportunities that help the businesses in the vicinity. We feel the density is appropriate in a destination center, the appropriate transitions that I just mentioned, and then the big turning point for staff, what, as I said, gave us the comfort that we were looking for that we didn't have when this first went to Town Council for a public hearing, was that signal warrant analysis. So this concludes staff's presentation. The applicant's present, and then following their comments, I'll be available for your questions.
Thank you. And I'll now invite the applicant to please come up.
Good evening to the new chairman, existing, and new planning board members. My name is Glenda Topp with Glenda S. Topp and Associates, and I'm here tonight representing the applicant H.H. Hunt. Just to start, the role of the Planning and Zoning Board is to review whether or not the request is consistent with the Cary Community Plan, and what I will go over tonight will show you how we do. The subject property is located within the Evans Farm neighborhood in the Austin Plan, which envisioned a mix of residential use types, including multifamily, townhomes, and detached residential. Within Evans Farm neighborhood, the subject property is located within the neighborhood edge and neighborhood general design zones, and these two design zones only allow for townhomes and detached residential. As staff pointed out, our request is to go MXD with the preliminary development plan to allow the addition of multifamily as a permitted use. The proposal is for 330 multifamily dwelling units, 41 townhomes, and a neighborhood recreation use and community gathering spaces. As staff pointed out, this will replace the base zoning of R40 with the required preliminary development plan. That plan will act as the conditions for the site as far as uses, setbacks, density, etc. But we've also added a zoning condition that states that the design elements of the Austin ACC plan will be maintained, so that even though it will have a different zoning, it will still have to comply with those design standards. The Austin Activity Concept Plan was adopted in March of 2006. The plan specified allowed uses and development limits and set design standards, including site design, circulation, streetscape entries, and public art location. Since the plan's adoption, there have been several amendments to the concept plan, primarily addressing the design elements. When the Austin plan was adopted, certain assumptions were made. Lines on the plan for neighborhood edge and neighborhood general were based on these assumptions. The plan assumed certain properties would be recombined and redeveloped together. The plan also assumed Austin Avenue would no longer exist. A neighborhood center was envisioned in this location, but instead the area developed as Evans Farm subdivision with a mix of townhomes and single-family homes. Because many of the assumptions that were made did not occur, it is challenging for new development to follow the Austin plan as adopted. The plan is too prescriptive. The proposed rezoning is a vehicle to fix this and bridge the gap between what was adopted and the realities of today. With the adoption of the Cary Community Plan in January of 2017, the subject property was designated as a destination center, and also there was time spent with staff going over what was the appropriate format to proceed with an amendment, and it was decided that going with MXD zoning with the preliminary development plan was the way to go. Just briefly going over compliance with the community plan, 3 policies in the Live chapter: providing more housing choices for all residents, more housing options in new neighborhoods, and provide the greatest variety of housing options in mixed-use centers. As pointed out, this is a destination center, which you typically see the higher densities and multifamily. The work chapter has a policy that focuses on enhancing locational appeal to business and workers by providing housing choices near RTP. This request will enhance the appeal to local businesses and workers. The SHOP chapter supports the development of a limited number of destination centers and commercial mixed-use centers. Of course, the Austin Area Destination Center is one of only 5 in Cary, and we believe that the higher density and use proposed is appropriate. The SHAPE chapter is also being met. Again, we're located in a destination center. We believe that the design of the preliminary development plan is a very walkable community. It has a pedestrian system that brings the entire development together in terms of being able to get to all areas of the site. We are proposing the most intense development at a destination center. It is at 540 and NC 55, which has a lot of services that the residents here will be able to use. And another important policy is in the SHAPE chapter is providing appropriate transitions, which we have done in terms of townhomes to townhomes and multifamily to multifamily. As staff pointed out, there was a question about open space. We are providing 3 times the amount, which is 15,300 square feet, and the requirement is only 4,000 square feet. So this is more than triple what's required. It's also distributed through the entire site, and this is in addition to a recreational amenity that is also planned for the community. After the Town Council public hearing, where there was concerns raised about transportation, as staff pointed out, 2 additional zoning conditions were added. Our engineer worked closely with the town staff and worked out the wording and the conditions in order for us to be in compliance with the MOVE chapter. In summary, the proposed MXD zoning with the preliminary plan does comply with the Cary Community Plan and the policies of the Live, Work, Shop, and SHAPE chapters, and we ask that the Planning and Zoning Board recommend approval. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll now turn it over to board questions.
I have a question. Okay.
Jump on in.
So the only, I'm not sure, I don't know. It's going to be on parking. But my question is, the only thing I saw, I mean, this looks good, but I was just concerned about, 30% reduction in parking, even if it's 1 bedroom, seems like a big percentage to me. And I know you're close to RTP, but getting public transportation out there is not the best in the world. And I know we've had reductions with, other applicants when it was like senior housing, for example. Mm-hmm. And this seems not of that nature. So that was my only concern, was the parking.
Applicant does have their engineer to speak to that. I will note that staff did not have an issue with the parking for the residential multifamily. A big part of that is because that does tend to be self-governing too. An apartment complex is not going to underpark. We don't support it for single-family detached or townhomes because it's a little bit harder to manage that way. But when you've got an apartment complex, you've usually got property management there making sure, if they don't have adequate parking, they're going to have trouble leasing their spaces as well. And so we do see this number used pretty frequently. But Ed Tang, the engineer for the applicant, can speak to their analysis as well.
When you say number, you mean like the calculation that
Yeah.
you're using to come up with the ratio?
Yeah, 30% is pretty typical, what we see requested.
So I'll add to what Ms. Grannon said, that typically with apartment multifamily, the town's parking regulations are on the high side in terms of what's required. We've worked with staff on this over several multifamily cases. We've gone to council with other cases where other applicants have requested 25 to 30% reduction, and it is generally granted because historically the parking that you might find in a community like this, they typically average about one space per bedroom or 1.6 spaces per unit. So when you do all the math, historically, it works out that way, and as Ms. Grannon mentioned, it is self-regulating. The developer typically will never want to underpark their tenants because nobody would rent from them if they did that. So generally, that 25-30% that council has agreed to on other cases has been used, and it has pretty much, I don't know of any parking problems in any of the apartment communities that have been developed that exist with that reduction, but it's a fairly acceptable practice based on historical data that we've seen, so.
I had a question about the setbacks. The setbacks are on townhomes are reduced substantially. Is that correct?
Can speak to that.
Seems like they're half of the normal standard or something.
They are providing the required 16 feet of separation between building units, between blocks of buildings, so that's standard. They're not seeking any reduction there. Let me take a look. One moment, because we have a chart in here that goes into that.
I thought there was a reduction from the standard. Am I incorrect about that?
The roadway setback, just slightly. Typically, you'd have a 10-foot setback from the roadway if there's no parking in the front, and 20 feet if there is parking. That was per the Alston plan. They're proposing an 18-foot roadway setback. That's actually more consistent with the land development ordinance. That's what we would require as well.
18 versus 20.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, I'm just looking through this. They're pretty consistent. They're pretty consistent with what we've seen in transitional residential neighborhoods. A 3-foot side yard setback for end units and a 3-foot rear yard setback. They're not going to have big lots with them, but we've seen that with PDDs, with MXDs before. So once again, you can sort of describe your own zoning district with the MXD and the preliminary
3
development
feet
plan.
didn't sound like a lot to me.
It's not, yeah. That's about the basic that you need to make sure you're in compliance with building code. If you don't have a minimum of 3 feet from the property line, then you have to do fire rating on the walls, so.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
There were a few transportation impacts that were noted in the report as being constructed by other developments. Are those developments actively moving forward?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
So I do have a question, kind of along the same lines as that. Looking specifically at the Alston Ridge Towns development, I believe the buffer being proposed in the townhome section is 10 feet. Is that correct?
With this particular project or with the
With this
adjacent?
particular project, yes.
Okay. And let's pull up the. So the perimeter buffer, yes, the perimeter buffer that's proposed is 10 feet adjacent to the townhome lots and 20 feet for the multifamily lots.
Great. And the LDO standard for 2 townhome communities, what would the standard be?
Let's see, that would be a class 4 to a class 4. Let's see if we're looking it up right now. Yeah, sorry about that. I think it's 20 also. We're double checking.
Okay.
It looked like a 20 to a 10.
Well, then each party would be responsible for half. So it's not, that would be consistent if that is
Oh, okay.
20 foot type B. So each party's responsible for half of that 20 feet. So it's consistent then.
Okay.
With typical ordinance requirements.
Okay. Great. Thank you. All right. If there are no other questions, I'll look for a motion.
I'll make a motion. I move that the board find case number 19 REZ02 is consistent with the comprehensive plan and all other applicable plans for the reasons set forth in the staff report, presentation, and discussion by the Planning and Zoning Board.
Second.
Discussion?
It just makes sense. That's kind of my area, and I know that's going to be a destination center, so it just makes sense for it to be more dense in that area.
Anything else?
Do you have anything to add?
Oh, I agree.
All right, we'll go ahead. Any other discussion? We will call it to a vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That carries unanimous. We'll be moving to our next case of this evening, also with Ms. Grannon, 19 REZ 15.
Thank you. This is a request that was made by the Board of Directors of the Sri Venkateswara Temple, which is located at Chapel Hill Road and Balaji Place on approximately 9.26 acres. It's also appropriate to refer to it as the SV Temple. So I was told that you don't have to try to pronounce the name if you'd like to just call it the SV Temple going forward. Subject property is comprised of 5 different parcels of land highlighted here in yellow, adjacent to Chapel Hill Road and adjacent to the CSX Railroad. The current zoning on the property is a combination of 3 different zoning districts. There's a little bit of industrial, there's R20, there's residential 40. So how did they get this temple here? Well, I'm going to tell you. They began acquiring land approximately 20 years ago and then received a special use permit back in 2005 to construct the first temple building. And then the first phase was completed in 2009. Now they're ready to move forward and complete the vision for the property. And they approached the town staff and said, we'd like to construct a Raj Gopuram or a Raja Gopuram, which is a decorative monument, a gateway feature that's common in the Hindu community with a temple of this sort. This is an example of what it could potentially look like. This plan has not been submitted yet. We don't know that it will look exactly like this, but this is an example of one that would be of potentially similar size. They've showed the proposed location here with the red star adjacent to the existing temple. This is an explanation of how Cary's land development ordinance works in relation to building heights or structure heights. If you're within 100 feet of a residential zoning district, you can have a maximum structure of 35 feet tall. If you're greater than 100 feet from residentially zoned property, you can go up to 50 feet tall. And then for each additional foot of building setback, you can go up 1 foot. Well, I showed you with that existing zoning slide, they're residential. 35 feet's not going to work. So they said, what do we do? How do we make this work? So the proposal was to rezone all the property to office and institutional, which would allow this rezoning, would allow the church to be on the property. And then they could use that 50 foot as a baseline. So if they get the zoning to something that would allow the religious assembly use and then takes away that residential zoning, they could start with a baseline of 50 feet, and then for each additional foot that they go back from the required setback. So if they've got a required setback up along Chapel Hill Road of 30 feet, then there's their 50-foot structure. They go back an additional 70 feet, they could get up to 90. So that's why they needed to go through the rezoning. And plus it makes more sense to go ahead and get all of these different individual parcels under that O&I zoning designation for future development of this property as a religious. Is office and institutional conditional use. The conditions that were proposed at the town council public hearing limited the use to religious assembly and accessory uses, stated that the height of the structure would be in compliance with LDO standards. And that scared a few people just a little bit, because I showed you, how it didn't take long to be able to get up to 90 feet. They said the monument, if constructed, would not be inhabited, would not have any speakers, bells, or noise-making devices, no antennas or telecommunications equipment, and that there'd be no increase in occupied structures beyond what's existing today, with the buildings on the site now a little over 18,000 square feet, and no construction or new uses added that would generate additional peak hour trips. So the temple couldn't start running a daycare, in their facility, that's going to impact peak hour trips. So when this was presented, this shows you the approximate location of the temple and the distance from the property line up along Chapel Hill Road, 200 feet. So all of a sudden you start to see this temple could get really, really tall. So 200 feet from that location, about 175 from the adjacent property owners, and council expressed those concerns. There were 4 attendees at the neighborhood meeting back in June, concerns about site conditions and the location and the height of the monument, questions about the Nancy Jones house, the historic house that's on the adjacent property. And we've had 4 phone calls and emails from adjacent property owners wanting some more detail about height and whether or not they would be doing something, about lighting on the property. So this shows you the adjacent parcel of land, which is currently the site of the Nancy Jones house, which has been purchased by the town of Cary, but we've got up to a year to relocate the house. That property is not part of this rezoning request. It's only the parcel shown in yellow. So the board of directors with the temple plans to do something here eventually, but that's not a part of the proposal or the plan right now. And at the council meeting, there were no other speakers other than the applicant and a member of the temple speaking in support. But the council had questions about the height of the structure and what sort of lighting was proposed. So since the town council public hearing, the applicant came back and modified the zoning conditions to set this cap, not to exceed 90 feet now. So as before, it could have gone up to probably be closer to 120 or 150 without this zoning condition based on where they had it set back. So that's a new condition. They still have the condition about no speakers, bells, noise-making devices, no increase in the occupied structures, no new peak hour trips. But as you'll see in the staff report, there's also a new zoning condition. There's not going to be any exterior lighting mounted on the outside of the structure. And they would still be able to have ground lights shining up on the structure, but they'd have to be shielded, pointing directly at the monument, and there would be limited hours of operation. They would not be operating between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. So this helped to provide some reassurance to the adjacent property owners. Staff analyzed the request against the Imagine Cary Community Plan and felt that this is something that could revitalize this corridor, that's helping to promote the vibrancy of this existing institutional use. We felt that the conditions provided appropriate transitions and that this also indirectly helps the work chapter by maintaining a strong and diverse local economy. So we have found the request to be consistent overall with the Imagine Cary Community Plan because it supports the live, work, and shape chapters. So this concludes staff's presentation, and then following the applicant's comments, I'll be available for your questions.
Great. Now I'll invite the applicant forward.
Good evening once again, Mr. Chairman and new and old planning board members. My name is Glenda Top. I'm here tonight representing the SV Temple of North Carolina that's located on Chapel Hill Road. As staff has pointed out, the request is to rezone the property to O&I conditional use. Currently, the properties as shown on the map have numerous zoning classifications, and in addition to this monument they're building, it was important to resolve the split zoning that's currently affecting the site, and it was encouraged to look at combining the subject properties, and this would help in several different ways. One in particular, the buffer requirements that would be in place if the zoning district was not one. Again, the O&I zoning district classification is important because it does allow the temple to fulfill their long-range vision and plans, which is building of a decorative monument. The request is to construct a decorative and culturally significant monument on their property as a complement to the existing religious assembly use. The monument feature serves as the main pedestrian entrance for the temple. The existing zoning, because of the height limitations, would not allow it. Again, the reason for the O&I conditional use zoning. The decorative monument will be uninhabitable and will not contain any speakers, bells, or other noise-making devices, and will not contain any antennas or other telecommunications equipment. It is important to note that the original approved development plans for the temple did include this monument, and on those plans it basically showed it in a very similar location where it is shown on the map today. The members of the temple are now seeking to complete the original construction plans of this monument. Again, it's an architectural feature that serves as a gateway to the temple. And in the Hindu religion, there is a timeline when this monument must be built, and it's based on when the original temple was built. So the monument must be constructed by May of 2021. And then when it is complete, this Hindu temple will be one of 3 in the United States to comply with the Southern Indian tradition. So it will be one of 3. Just briefly, the Indian church or temple committed to Cary over 20 years ago, and they become an integral part of the community. They feel that they've added some richness to the fabric of Cary. They offer a lot of activities, both at the temple and outside the temple, that many people in Cary enjoy. There was a concern about height and and lighting. We have limited the height to 90 feet. And again, with the condition of no external light fixtures will be mounted. And in the event there are external light fixtures, there is that time limit of 11 to 7 p.m. In your staff report, it goes over the chapters of the Cary Community Plan that the proposed rezoning comply with, the Live, Work, and Shape chapter, and I'm not going to repeat what Ms. Grannon said since she did such a marvelous job. But I will conclude by saying the members of the temple are very proud of who they are, and they are very proud to call Cary their home. Based on compliance with the Cary Community Plan, we ask the Planning and Zoning Board to recommend approval. Thank you. And I want to add one other thing, since there's really nobody else here. Whoever does your presentation and everything, they're excellent on the mapping part. I thought I'd just compliment. I don't know who does it, but very good job.
Well, thank you. Now open it up to board questions.
I don't really have a question. I just think it's gorgeous. It is beautiful.
I have a question, and this is more of, I appreciate all the proposed conditions that have been laid out to deal with questions in the community, but I'm just curious, how is compliance with the conditions enforced? Like the limited hours, like, I'm just curious.
Oh, we will get phone calls if yeah.
Okay. I was just wondering.
We have a staff of development compliance officers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so they actually, they're under a separate, department, but they're right physically located in the planning department. So they're a short phone call away if we get a phone call that we observe something. So
Yeah,
it's a good question. Certain things will be reviewed as part of the development plan review when they come in showing the structure, but the hours of operation, that's pretty easy to, they're not going to like it when we call them and tell them they have to go over there, late at night to observe it. But if we've observed that happening, we will be reaching out to the property owners and letting them know to bring it into compliance.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent question, though.
Any other questions? In that case, I'll be looking for a motion.
I can make a motion. As soon as I remember the case number.
That's always the problem.
I know, it's terrible. I move that the board find case number 19 REZ.
15.
Whoops, see, I told you I had the wrong number. Sorry. 19 REZ 15 is consistent with the comprehensive plan and all other applicable plans for the reasons set forth in the staff report, presentation, and discussion by the Planning and Zoning Board.
I'll second it.
Discussion?
I mean, if you look at this, I agree, the monument is beautiful. I know there's some concerns with the height. It's kind of on a slope already, 90 feet is tall, but there's other things around it that look like maybe they're 30, 40 feet, you know, a little bit further down. So I don't think it would be that out of, you know, alignment with everything else.
I would agree that the structure does look gorgeous. This has been a difficult site for these people to work with going back 20 years, and they've had to struggle with it. And this seems like, from a zoning perspective, a pretty reasonable way to deal with just a conglomeration of zoning. And the temple out there has actually been a significant improvement to the area. We can all remember when there's probably gravel and logs sitting out there instead of a nice temple. So I think it's a great addition to the community, and I hope the council will approve it.
I agree. I think that it's one of three is pretty amazing for Cary. And I like the way that we're supporting different cultures and different beliefs. I think it's very important to support them.
Yeah, I agree with those comments. I heard a statistic recently about the percentage of people moving to the Cary community from international locations. So I think this is just another representation of that type of diversity. And I agree, it's also architecturally beautiful. So I also hope that the council supports the application.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with the comments that have already been made. It seems like they have a very strong presence in this area, and certainly in that part of town, there's a lot of people that are utilizing that facility. So this is just an extension of that, and obviously the time frame is important to make sure that this gets completed.
Oh, yeah.
Well said.
Great. In that case, we'll call this to a vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Well, that vote carries unanimous. That closes us out for this evening for our cases. We do not have a closed session, so I'll be looking for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? We're adjourned.
This has been a production of Cary TV. Visit the Town of Cary's website at townofcary.org.